Get down on the ground now." The cop's voice screamed. Skylar, the black girl, blinked. Her heart pounded. What's happening? One of the cops, Detective Sullivan, stormed forward, grabbing her arm before she could even react. "Don't play dumb. You know exactly what's happening. You were just seen making a drop in the back lot." Skylar's mind spun. Making a drop? What were they talking about? What? Her voice shook as she tried to understand. "I just came in to buy." "Say the hands behind your back." Before she could protest, she was yanked backward. Her wrists snapped into cold metal. Handcuffs. Panic clawed at her throat. "Wait. This is a mistake. I don't know what you're talking about. I just got here." But they weren't listening. As we delve into this story, if you strongly stand against injustice and prejudice, tell us where you're watching from, and click on the subscribe button now. Only those who support injustice won't subscribe. Days later, the courtroom was silent. But not the kind of silence that brings peace. This is the kind of silence before a storm. The kind that holds injustice in its grip and dares anyone to fight back. At the center of it all, Skylar Monroe, a young black woman barely out of high school, sits handcuffed at the defendant's table. Her wrists are red from the metal biting into her skin. Her back is straight, but her eyes betray the storm inside her. The storm of fear, of shock, of betrayal. Across from her, Detectives Reed and Sullivan sit too comfortably, their smirks barely hidden. The white officers exchange glances, their confidence oozing from their posture. This isn't their first time doing this. It's not even their 100th. They've played this game before, and they've always won. The judge, an older man with a stone-cold expression, leans back in his chair, barely acknowledging the defense. He's not interested in hearing Skylar's side of the story. His bias is clear, written in the deep furrow of his brow and the dismissive wave of his hand whenever Skylar's lawyer speaks. The prosecutor stands, a polished smile on his lips, turning toward the jury with the ease of a man who already knows the verdict. "The evidence is overwhelming," he declares, motioning toward a black duffel bag filled with drugs that never belonged to Skylar. Skylar's throat tightens. She wants to scream, wants to fight, wants to tell them this is all a setup. But the system isn't designed to listen to people like her. She glances over at her mother, sitting in the gallery, tears streaming down her face. Then her eyes shift to the back of the courtroom. There a man sits quietly, still as stone. His dark eyes don't move, his face unreadable. His suit is crisp, his posture relaxed. At first glance, he looks like any other spectator. But there's something different about him. Something cold. Calculating. Dangerous. Skylar's father, David Monroe, is watching. He doesn't flinch. He doesn't react. He waits. The prosecutor continues, his voice growing stronger, more confident. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he says, pacing the room like a man who owns it. "We have not one, but 3 witnesses who saw the defendant in possession of these drugs." He turns to the 2 corrupt cops, nodding. Reed and Sullivan sit up straighter, ready to play their part. Skylar watches in horror as they lie through their teeth. "We observed Miss Monroe attempting to distribute these narcotics in a school parking lot," Detective Reed states. His voice is smooth, practiced, like he's done this 100 times before. The jury nods. The judge doesn't blink. The public defender barely objects. Skylar's heart pounds. She wants to scream, "I wasn't even there," but she knows it wouldn't matter. The jury was already convinced before this trial even started. And the cops? They look proud of themselves, like they're untouchable, like they can plant evidence, lie under oath, destroy lives, and walk away laughing. And in any other case, they would have. But this time, they framed the wrong girl. David Monroe doesn't move, he doesn't react. But in his mind, he's already dismantling every single person in this room. Every cop, every lawyer, every corrupt official. They had no idea who they're dealing with. The trial continues, but the real war? It's already begun. The prosecutor walks toward the jury, smiling. He's already celebrating. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a clear case. The defendant was caught red-handed, and the testimony from 2 respected officers confirms it. Respected? Skylar almost laughs. The judge leans forward, finally speaking, his voice booming through the courtroom. Miss Monroe, he says, his tone condescending. Do you have anything to say before I hand down my verdict? Skylar opens her mouth, but her eyes move to her father again. David Monroe still hasn't moved, still hasn't reacted. But this time, she sees it. A ghost of a smirk, a silent promise, a warning. To them, they thought they've won. They thought it was over. But this was just the beginning. What do you think will happen next? Let us know in the comments and make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the moment these corrupt cops get exactly what they deserve. Let's get to how it all started. It was supposed to be a normal evening. Skylar Monroe had just left her college campus, her mind still buzzing with the details of her upcoming midterm exams. She was ahead in all her classes, pulling straight A's, and had already received internship offers from 3 major firms. She had her future mapped out, and nowhere in that plan did it include sitting in the back of a police car with handcuffs biting into her wrists. But that's exactly where she found herself. How did this happen? It started with a single stop at a convenience store. Skylar had no idea that when she pulled into the small gas station on the corner of Ridgewood and Main, she was walking into a trap. The neighborhood wasn't bad, but it wasn't upper class either. She'd stopped here plenty of times before. It was just a place to grab a snack, to fill up her gas tank before heading back home. But that night, the moment she stepped inside, something felt off. There were 2 men in the back of the store, talking in hushed tones. They weren't buying anything, just watching. And then there was the cashier, an older man who looked nervous, like he was waiting for something to happen. Skylar should have trusted her instincts, but she ignored the feeling, shook it off. She grabbed a bottle of water, a bag of chips, and walked up to the counter. And that's when it happened. Before Skylar could even react, she heard the screech of tires. Police cars. Red and blue lights flashed outside the windows. The next thing she knew, the front door slammed open and 2 officers rushed inside. Get your hands where we can see them, now. The voice was loud, commanding, unnecessary. Skylar froze, confused. The cashier, the 2 men in the back, none of them moved. The cops weren't looking at them. They were looking at her. Outside, more officers had gathered. People from the neighborhood had come out to watch. Skylar's body trembled as she was dragged toward a police car, the lights blinding, the officers gripping her like she was a dangerous criminal. She spotted a woman filming on her phone, whispering, "This is messed up." Skylar tried to turn toward her, tried to beg for someone to listen. "I didn't do anything. Please, I was just inside the store." Detective Reed stepped in front of her, his expression unreadable, but his voice was filled with arrogance. "Oh yeah? Then why were you spotted making an exchange with a known drug dealer out back?" Skylar felt her stomach drop. "What? I wasn't even... We've got 2 witnesses that saw you. And guess what? We just found this." Reed held up a black duffel bag, a bag she had never seen before. A bag filled with bricks of drugs. Skylar stared at it, her mouth dry. This wasn't real. This wasn't happening. "That's not mine. I don't even... Where did you get that?" Reed scoffed, shaking his head. "Oh, come on. You're really gonna stand here and pretend this isn't yours? You were seen coming out of the back lot right before we arrived. You think we don't know what's going on?" Skylar felt like screaming. "I wasn't in the back lot. I was inside the store. Check the cameras. The cashier saw me. The other customers." But when she turned toward the cashier, her last hope, the man looked down. Said nothing. Skylar's chest tightened. He was scared. Or worse, he was in on it. Her heart raced. This wasn't just a bad misunderstanding. This was planned, set up from the start. "Please, Check the store footage. It will prove. Sullivan shoved her forward. Oh, we'd love to check the footage, but see, there's been a little problem. Looks like the cameras were down tonight. Too bad. Skylar's stomach twisted into knots. They were lying. They had everything covered. And the worst part? No one was going to stop them. Back at home, David Monroe was cleaning his gun. His phone buzzed. A single message from a restricted number. They took her. Ridgewood in Maine. Afterwards, Skylar was granted permission to make a call. She speedily dialed her father. Dad, I'm being arrested for something I know nothing about. Please help me. David set the gun down slowly. He stared at the message for a long moment. Then he picked up his keys. If these men thought they could take his daughter and get away with it, they were about to find out exactly how wrong they were. The air in the courtroom was thick with the weight of an unspoken truth. This wasn't about justice. It never had been. It was about control. About reminding people like Skylar Monroe that the system wasn't built for them. That no matter how innocent they were, no matter how clean their record, all it took was a lie from the right person to take everything away. She sat there, wrists bound, back straight, her face carefully blanked even as her heart hammered inside her chest. They had her trapped, but she wouldn't let them see her break. Detectives Reed and Sullivan sat across from her, lounging back in their chairs like kings in their own castle, their expressions smug, their uniforms crisp. They had done this before. They knew how this game was played, and they knew exactly how it would end, because they had made sure of it. Reed glanced at his watch, bored. Sullivan leaned back, arms crossed, his grin just a little too wide, just a little too pleased. Skylar clenched her jaw. She knew why they were so confident. Because the evidence was fake. The drugs they found? Planted. The witnesses they claimed to have? Lies. The so-called missing body cam footage that would have cleared her name? A convenient technical error. They had set her up perfectly. And worst of all, the jury, the judge, the prosecutor, they all knew it. But none of them cared. The prosecutor, a middle-aged man with slicked-back hair and a voice polished from years of practice, stepped forward. His words were like a well-rehearsed script, each one designed to twist the truth into something unrecognizable. Ms. Monroe was found in possession of a large quantity of illegal substances, he said, his voice rich with false sympathy. Drugs that, based on the testimony of two highly respected officers, were intended for distribution. Now, we all want to believe in second chances. We all want to believe in redemption. But let's not be naive. This isn't about a misunderstanding. This is about keeping our communities safe. Safe. Skylar almost laughed at the word. How was she a threat? She was a college freshman, an honor student who had never so much as touched a cigarette in her life. She had spent her entire life doing everything right, making sure she never gave anyone a reason to doubt her. But it hadn't mattered. It never mattered. Because when the system decided you were guilty, the truth became irrelevant. Her attorney, a frazzled, overworked public defender, stood up weakly, flipping through his notes. He wasn't bad at his job, but he had no real power here. He knew it. Skylar knew it. Even the jury knew it. Your Honor, her lawyer began, voice shaking, the prosecution has yet to present any concrete forensic evidence linking my client to these charges. The alleged drugs? The judge waved a hand, already disinterested. Move it along, counselor. Skylar felt her stomach drop. He wasn't even pretending to be fair. Her mother sat a few rows back, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Tears slipped down her cheeks, but she stayed silent, helpless to do anything but watch. Skylar turned her head slightly, to the back of the room, to the man who had said nothing this entire time. Her father, David Monroe, was still there, unmoved, expressionless. He sat with perfect stillness, his hands folded neatly in his lap, his eyes locked on the front of the room. He hadn't reacted once, hadn't stood up, hadn't argued, because he was waiting, watching, planning. While the court proceeding was going on, he stood up and stepped out. David Monroe didn't storm out in anger. He didn't cause a scene. He didn't threaten anyone. No. Because David Monroe was a different kind of man. And men like him? They didn't beg for justice. They delivered it. Long before he was a father, David Monroe had been something else entirely. A ghost. A weapon. A man whose name was whispered in terror in underground networks across the world. The CIA hadn't just trained him. They had built him into something beyond lethal. He had spent 2 decades hunting the most dangerous criminals on the planet. Cartel leaders, warlords, corrupt politicians, arms dealers. He didn't just know how corruption worked. He knew how to dismantle it. He had infiltrated systems that were far more powerful, far more protected than a bunch of dirty cops playing judge and executioner in a rigged courtroom. And now, they had his daughter. They had no idea what they had just done. David Monroe didn't call lawyers, because lawyers couldn't fix this. No, he called people in high places, people who didn't exist on paper, people who could erase in police departments if they wanted to. The first call? DOJ. He didn't ask for favors, he gave them a choice. Check your email in 5 minutes. After that, you'll know why you're about to do exactly what I say. Click. The second call? Internal Affairs. Reed and Sullivan, pull their records. You're gonna want to take notes. Click. The third call? The FBI. And this one? This one wasn't just a favor. This was a personal request to an old contact. I need Vanessa. He said quietly to his old contact. David Monroe knows detectives Reed and Sullivan think they are untouchable. They have been doing this for years, framing innocent people, destroying lives, fabricating evidence, making sure their records were clean every time Internal Affairs came sniffing around. But there was one thing they never saw coming. David Monroe knew how to find ghosts. And now, they were the ghosts he was hunting. Vanessa had once been one of the best undercover FBI informants in the country. She had spent years infiltrating corrupt organizations, exposing networks of crime from the inside. Disguised as a journalist, she started asking questions. Why was every drug case in the last 10 years connected to Reed and Sullivan? Oh, they always framed innocent black people so they can be recognized by the society as avengers and given good promotions. Why did key evidence go missing whenever they made an arrest? Why did every black suspect they arrested get the harshest possible sentencing? And the biggest question of all, why were they so confident they'd never be caught? Then the first crack started forming. David Monroe knew exactly who to call next. Not the police, not the media. A hacker. A man who owed him a favor. I need the store footage, the original, not the one they showed in court. The hacker didn't ask questions, because when David Monroe asked for something, you gave it to him. Within 10 minutes the footage was recovered. The real footage. The footage that showed Skylar never touched the duffel bag. The cops planted it. There was no drug deal. And then the hacker found something else. Something much, much bigger. Every single false conviction Reed and Sullivan had orchestrated. Every crime they had pinned on someone else. And worst of all, a hidden recording. One they never thought would see the light of day. Reed's voice. Laughing. Bragging in a video saying, we could throw a brick of coke at any black kid in this city, and a jury will still take our word over theirs. It's that easy. The evidence was undeniable, and David Monroe had just put the noose around their necks. Back to the court proceeding, Skylar wasn't sure when she had started holding her breath, but she exhaled slowly, forcing her pulse to steady. Her father wasn't the kind of man to let things slide. And if he was this calm, then that meant one thing. The cops who did this, they were already finished, but they just didn't know it yet. The prosecution wrapped up their scripted lies, and it was time for Detective Reed to take the stand. He walked up with an air of pure arrogance, adjusting his tie before settling into the witness chair. The lies started immediately. Miss Monroe was acting suspiciously the night of the arrest, Reed said smoothly, looking toward the jury with practiced ease. She was seen leaving a known drug house. When we approached, she became hostile and refused to cooperate. Hostile? Schuyler's fingers curled into fists. What he meant was, she had asked why she was being stopped. What he meant was, she had dared to use her rights. And for that, she was labeled a threat. She resisted arrest, Reed continued, and attempted to flee. We later discovered the drugs in her vehicle, hidden under the passenger seat. Lies. Every word. Her lawyer tried to push back, but the judge shut him down with a warning glare. The case moved forward, piece by piece, the prosecution painting a picture of a dangerous girl who deserved to be locked away. The jury ate it up. The judge barely listened. The weight of the moment pressed against Schuyler Monroe's chest, heavy and suffocating. This wasn't a trial. It was an execution. A performance where the actors had already rehearsed their lines. The script was already written, and the ending was decided before she even walked into the room. The walls of the courtroom felt smaller, closing in around her. The polished wooden floors, the stiff chairs, the cold gaze of the judge, all of it blurred into the background as she sat there, hands clasped together, trying to hold on to the last bit of hope she had left. Hope. What a pathetic thing to have in a place like this, because she could already see the way this was going to play out. The jury sat there, stiff and indifferent, barely looking at her. The prosecutor stood tall, confident, as if he knew this was a game he couldn't lose. And then there were the cops, Detectives Reed and Sullivan, sitting at the prosecution's table like they had just won a championship. Their smirks were subtle but undeniable, their arrogance seeping into every movement. The judge's voice cut through the silence like a blade. The prosecution may continue. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a navy blue suit stepped forward, the prosecutor. The man who had spent the last 6 months building a case out of lies. He turned to face the jury, his expression carefully crafted, balancing between authority and false sympathy. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice steady and measured, "what we have here is a case of a young woman making a series of very poor choices. A case of law enforcement doing their job, protecting our communities from dangerous criminals." Schuyler clenched her fists. "We have evidence. We have witnesses. We have everything we need to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that Ms. Monroe was caught in possession of illegal substances with intent to distribute." And there it was, the lie, wrapped in a perfectly rehearsed speech. The prosecutor gestured toward the black duffel bag sitting on the evidence table. The bag they claimed she had been carrying. The bag that had been planted before she even stepped foot in that gas station. He moved to the screen at the front of the courtroom, pressing a button on the remote in his hand. The grainy video played. Footage of a dark parking lot. A silhouette of a woman standing near a car, her face unclear, handing something off to another figure. The jury leaned forward. The prosecutor turned back to them, shaking his head. "This is a classic case of a criminal who doesn't want to face the consequences of her actions. She was seen, she was caught, and now she wants to convince you that she's innocent." Schuyler's chest tightened. That wasn't her. That wasn't her in the video. But that wouldn't matter, would it? The jury already believed it was. The judge didn't care. Her lawyer wasn't even trying to fight back. "Call your first witness, counselor," the judge said, bored. And then Detective Sullivan took the stand. He walked up with the ease of a man who had done this before, sat down with confidence, adjusted his tie, and leaned forward, ready to play his part in this performance. Schuyler couldn't even look at him. "Detective Sullivan, can you walk us through what happened the night of the arrest?" Sullivan cleared his throat, then put on his best, "I'm just here to protect the community" face. Of course, we had been monitoring suspicious activity in the area for weeks. We knew there was drug trafficking happening in that location. When we spotted Ms. Monroe making an exchange in the back lot, we knew we had to step in. And when you approached her, what happened? She resisted arrest, Your Honor. A bead of silence. Skylar felt a wave of nausea rise in her stomach. Lies. Every single word out of his mouth. The prosecutor nodded sympathetically. So you're saying that Miss Monroe was not only in possession of drugs, but she also became aggressive when confronted by law enforcement? Sullivan sighed dramatically. Unfortunately, yes. We tried to handle it professionally, but she was uncooperative. We had no choice but to detain her. Skylar couldn't breathe. Thank you, Detective Sullivan. No further questions. Skylar's lawyer stood up. Weak, hesitant. Detective Sullivan, there is no body cam footage of the arrest, correct? That's correct. And no DNA evidence linking Ms. Monroe to the drugs in the duffel bag? Sullivan paused, then smirked. No, but we have our eyewitness testimony, and in my experience, criminals don't always leave a trail. A few chuckles rippled through the jury. Skylar's hands shook with rage. The judge sighed loudly. Move it along, counselor. And just like that, her lawyer gave up. No further questions, Your Honor. It was over. It had been over before it even started. The trial is rigged. The cops are winning, but the moment David Monroe steps in, the entire courtroom is about to turn upside down. What do you think happens next? Drop your predictions in the comments and make sure to subscribe, because when a CIA agent strikes, justice doesn't just happen, it's delivered. The jury filed out. Minutes later, they returned. The judge cleared his throat, fixing Skylar with a look of finality. Has the jury reached a verdict? A woman stood, expressionless. We have, Your Honor. And what is your verdict? A pause. Then, guilty. The courtroom erupted. Her mother collapsed. The cops shook hands, congratulating each other. Skylar's vision blurred. 20 years. 20 years for a crime she didn't commit. The judge's gavel slammed against the wood. Sentencing will proceed immediately. She felt like she was sinking, drowning. The reality of 20 years in prison was looming over her. The courtroom was charged with a sense of finality. The prosecution's victory seemed inevitable. They thought they had won. They thought they had destroyed her, had her neatly boxed in. But they had no idea what was about to happen. As Skylar sat there, trying to breathe through the panic, she couldn't help but notice the satisfied smiles on the faces of Detectives Reed and Sullivan, the two men who had set everything in motion. Their eyes flickered with triumph, and they exchanged a quiet, smug glance, as if savoring the moment of victory. Reed's hand reached for his collar, adjusting it with a casual air, while Sullivan smirked, almost as if to say, we did it again. Another life ruined, another win for us. Their arrogance was palpable, their confidence unshaken. But what they didn't know, what no one knew, was that everything was about to change. But then a great man came into the courtroom. The courtroom had been a stage, and Skylar Monroe had been the sacrificial lamb. The system had played its role flawlessly. The fake evidence, the false witnesses, the corrupt cops and judge, all moving in perfect unison to destroy an innocent girl's life. But the moment her father walked into that courtroom, the countdown to their downfall began. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier with the judge's gavel set for final sentencing. The doors opened with a sudden creak. David Monroe entered the room. His presence, quiet yet commanding, slicing through the tension like a hot knife through butter. His appearance was calm, collected, unshaken by the chaos around him. His black suit was perfectly tailored, and his posture was that of someone who had seen far worse than this. His expression was stoic, but those who knew him understood. He wasn't here for the show. He was here for a purpose that would shatter the very foundation of the courtroom's rigged system. Skylar glanced toward the back of the room. Her heart leaped as she saw him. Her father, David Monroe. the most dangerous man in the room, yet his demeanor was as calm as ever. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. He simply walked to the front of the courtroom and handed a classified folder to the judge. The judge looked at the folder, then at David, his confusion clear. "What is this?" he asked, though the hesitation in his voice betrayed a sense of unease. David didn't flinch. He didn't speak for a moment, letting the silence linger and grow heavier. "Your Honor, before you pass final sentencing, I suggest you read what's inside." David's voice was soft, yet it carried an unmistakable weight. There was no anger, no rush, just the steady confidence of a man who knew exactly how the world worked, and how he would take it down. The judge, already irritated, hesitated, his fingers twitching at the edges of the folder, unsure whether to even open it. His eyes narrowed, but he gave in, flicking the folder open. The moment his eyes hit the first document, his face went pale. The courtroom was still, the collective breath of everyone seemingly caught in their throats. The truth had arrived. The judge barely managed to compose himself, but by then, it was clear. This was no ordinary piece of evidence. The room had shifted in an instant. Every eye was on the folder, the judge and David Monroe. The prosecutor, who had just minutes ago been basking in the success of his victory, now looked like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, his expression betraying confusion, then panic. David's calm was like a storm ready to break. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating as the defense attorney, now armed with the most dangerous of weapons, stepped forward and pressed the button on the monitor to show the real footage. The first image on the screen was grainy. An unmarked police car pulling into a dark parking lot. Skylar's car was parked there, but she wasn't doing anything suspicious. The video was unedited, untouched, a real-time capture of the events as they had actually unfolded. Skylar was simply entering the convenience store. There was no drug deal, no exchange, just a girl buying a snack. The camera angle shifted, and there was no mystery, no crime, nothing but Skylar. The room was dead silent. The prosecutor's jaw clenched as his lies unraveled in front of him, but it wasn't over. Not yet. The second clip started playing. This time, body cam footage. The familiar crackling of the police radios filled the silence. The camera showed Detective Reed walking behind the police vehicle, holding a black duffel bag in his hands. Reed moved toward Skylar's car, and with deliberate motions, he slipped the bag under her seat. The footage didn't lie. It was as clear as day. The drugs they had accused her of possessing? Planted. The entire case was built on lies, and now the truth was playing out for everyone to see. The prosecutor's face turns red. Detective Reed's smirk vanishes. Detective Sullivan reaches for his collar, sweat gathering on his forehead. This isn't possible. They erased this footage. They covered their tracks. Didn't they? The prosecutor shoots to his feet. Your Honor, I object. The judge doesn't even look at him, because at that moment, Detective Sullivan's smirk faltered. Reed's face drained of color. The jury sat forward, whispering among themselves, unable to process what they were seeing. The room was vibrating with energy, a mix of disbelief and outrage. And then the real bombshell dropped. Audio footage of Reed and Sullivan talking, no bragging, about framing innocent black people. Reed's voice, so casual, so confident, filled the courtroom. We could throw a brick of coke at any black kid in this city, and a jury will still take our word over theirs. It's that easy. The courtroom erupted. There was no more hiding the truth. The smug smiles on Reed and Sullivan's faces faded into panic as they realized their dirty deeds had been exposed. The prosecutor, once so confident, wiped sweat from his forehead, unable to look anyone in the eye. The judge, who had dismissed all objections, suddenly found himself surrounded by the law he had ignored for years. And then it came. The final blow. David Monroe stood up, every eye in the courtroom locked on him. His voice was steady, unwavering. You thought my daughter was just another statistic. You thought no one would come for her. But you made a mistake. You framed the wrong girl. The words hung in the air. Reed and Sullivan exchanged a quick, nervous glance, realizing they had no way out. The tension was electric, crackling in the room. David's eyes locked onto theirs, his words cutting through the chaos. The judge, unable to regain control, sat in stunned silence as Skylar Monroe was freed. The crowd in the gallery began to murmur, and Skylar stood, her hand shaking as it was released from the cuffs. Her eyes locked onto her father, David, who didn't even flinch. He simply nodded at her, as though this moment had been years in the making. Then suddenly, the doors swing open, and in walks the DOJ, followed by FBI agents, followed by Internal Affairs, warrants in hand. Federal agents move in fast, heading straight for Detectives Reed and Sullivan. The two men who had been so confident, who had once smirked and laughed in this very courtroom. They aren't laughing anymore. Their hands are yanked behind their backs as cuffs snap into place, the same way they had cuffed innocent people for years. The judge tries to stand, but a DOJ agent steps forward, placing a file on his desk. A second investigation. Into him. The judge falls back into his chair, his world crumbling around him. The FBI and DOJ agents had been waiting, their presence undeniable as they stormed into the courtroom, their eyes locked on the guilty parties. The agents moved quickly, handcuffing Reed and Sullivan with swift efficiency. The defense attorney, with newfound evidence, called for a reversal of Skylar's conviction, and in mere moments the case was completely overturned. The moment the FBI entered, there was no mistaking it. The air shifted, charged with the unmistakable tension of authority. Detectives Reed and Sullivan, those smug, corrupt officers, were about to find out that no one is untouchable forever. As the agents stormed in, Reed and Sullivan's faces fell, their arrogant expressions replaced with shock and fear. The moment they realized what was happening, the room was flooded with the suffocating weight of betrayal. They had manipulated the system, framed an innocent girl, and yet they still believed they were untouchable. But this was the moment their entire empire crumbled. You're under arrest for perjury, corruption, and evidence tampering. The FBI agent's voice was steady, unshakable. It echoed across the courtroom, drowning out the stunned gasps of the spectators. Reed and Sullivan were dragged out of the courtroom in handcuffs, their smug grins replaced by panic. They could do nothing but watch in horror as their careers, built on lies and deception, came crashing down around them. Skylar's mother, wiping her tears, whispered, "They finally got what they deserved." But it wasn't just Reed and Sullivan. The corruption ran deep. The district attorney, once so confident in his prosecution, was now under investigation for pushing false convictions, encouraging the system to turn a blind eye to the truth. The judge, who had facilitated the miscarriage of justice, was forced to resign in disgrace. His hands, once powerful, now as Skylar sat in the courtroom, her heart raced. She could feel the weight of everything she had been through. The years of pain, the years of injustice, hanging in the air. She wasn't sure if she could breathe. The judge, who had once been so eager to send her to prison, now had no choice but to overturn the conviction. The evidence was undeniable. The truth had emerged, and Skylar Monroe, the innocent black girl framed by the system, was now free. Her mother collapsed into her arms, sobbing with relief. For the first time in so long, Skylar didn't feel like a criminal. For the first time, she felt like she could finally breathe. The courtroom erupted into cheers, but Skylar's focus was on her father, David Monroe. As he stood, his expression calm and steady, he reached for her hand. He didn't say anything. There was no need to. The emotional weight of the moment hung between them. He had saved her. The moment the judge announced the overturning of the verdict, Skylar's world seemed to shatter and rebuild all at once. She was free. But this wasn't just about her. The real work was just beginning. Skylar Monroe is set free, And as she stands, finally unchained, she turns to her father. David Monroe simply nods. The two of them walk out together, past the crumbling remains of a corrupt courtroom, past the prosecutor, who looks like he's about to vomit, past the detectives, who are being dragged away in cuffs, past the judge, who knows his career is over. And as they step outside, into the fresh air, Skylar is finally free. And justice was finally served. David Monroe didn't just stop at exposing Reed and Sullivan. He had already made calls, used his connections, and leveraged his power to launch a massive federal investigation into the police department. It wasn't just about punishing the two officers. It was about dismantling the entire corrupt network that allowed them to operate freely. The FBI began digging into the department's dirty files, uncovering a pattern of corruption that extended far beyond Reed and Sullivan. The Department of Justice launched an investigation into the entire precinct, uncovering fake reports, false arrests, and fabricated evidence, all designed to keep certain communities in fear and powerless. Internal Affairs, now under intense scrutiny, began its own investigation into its own ranks. The system was about to be dismantled piece by piece. But even as the system collapsed, Skylar knew her journey was far from over. She had suffered, physically, emotionally, mentally. The scars would remain long after the cameras stopped flashing and the press moved on. But Skylar was a fighter. She wasn't going to sit back and let her pain define her. In the aftermath of her release, Skylar began to take legal action against the officers who had framed her. With the full weight of her father's connections behind her, she made sure they didn't just lose their jobs. They were held accountable for everything they had done. But Skylar didn't stop there. Her fight wasn't just about herself. It was about every victim of a corrupt system. She began working with activist groups, becoming a voice for change and justice. Every victim of police corruption needed someone to stand up for them, just as her father had done for her. Skylar's apologies started to come from the people who had once doubted her, even from some members of the jury who had been manipulated by false evidence. But the most meaningful apology came from her mother, who, after years of helplessness, could finally see her daughter not as a victim, but as a warrior. Skylar's story, along with her father's silent yet powerful intervention, sparked a nationwide movement. People began to take to the streets, demanding accountability from police departments, from prosecutors, from the very systems that had allowed injustice to reign for so long. Skylar's story was used to advocate for change, not just in her own community, but across the entire nation. Skylar's face became a symbol of resilience. She was no longer just a victim of the system. She had become its reckoning. The protests grew larger, the calls for police reform more urgent, and the national conversation about systemic racism gained unprecedented traction. David Monroe's influence behind the scenes had turned the tide, but it was Skylar who was leading the charge for real, lasting change. As Skylar's activism grew, so did the investigations into everyone who had played a part in her frame-up. The judge who had ignored the evidence and rubber-stamped the corrupt officer's case was not exempt. His role in allowing the false conviction to happen didn't go unnoticed. David Monroe used every last piece of his influence to ensure the judge faced accountability. He didn't just lose his job, he faced public disgrace, and charges of misconduct were filed against him. The judge, once seen as an authority figure, was reduced to a cautionary tale. The man who failed to see justice when it was right in front of him. Skylar Monroe stands tall at the front of a rally for police reform, her voice steady as she speaks about the long road she's walked, from the nightmare of a false conviction to becoming a beacon of change. As she speaks, her father stands beside her, a silent support. The two of them, a powerful duo against a broken system. Skylar's journey was far from over, but it wasn't about the past anymore. It was about the future. As she walks beside her father, both of them stronger, wiser, and unbreakable, it's clear that this fight was just the beginning. The gavel had long since come down, but the echoes of that courtroom judgment reverberated throughout the entire city. The corrupt officers, the fraudulent judge, and the biased system had all tried to silence her, to destroy her, to break her spirit. But Skylar was still standing, stronger, unbroken. In the weeks following her release, the magnitude of her victory started to take shape. Skylar, with her father David standing silently in the background, had become a symbol of justice, one that could not be purchased, one that could not be bought off by the very system that had once conspired against her. She wasn't just a victim. She was a fighter, a warrior, and now she was about to prove it once again. Skylar took a deep breath as she walked into the courtroom once again, this time for her own fight. The multi-million-dollar lawsuit against the city was underway. The false arrest, the false charges, the frame-up, all of it. The city had wronged her, and now she was going to make sure they paid the price. With David Monroe's connections, the case was no longer just a personal vendetta. It had become a national statement against police corruption. The lawyer representing her wasn't just any regular defense attorney. David Monroe had made sure of that. This was a team of legal experts, some of the best in the country, brought in with one goal: to make sure Skylar's victory was not just symbolic, but financially and legally binding. The courtroom was tense as the defense tried to downplay the magnitude of what had happened. But Skylar's lawyer, calm and composed, laid down the hard facts. The false evidence, the manufactured charges, the years of suffering. The lawyer presented irrefutable proof: the fake body cam footage, the planted drugs, the testimonies of those who had tried to bury the truth. And the most damning piece of all, David Monroe's influence. He had gone to great lengths to ensure that Skylar's case wasn't just about the system's corruption. It was about creating lasting change, and that meant holding the system accountable in every way possible. And then, the unthinkable happened. The judge ruled in Skylar's favor. The city was ordered to pay her a multi-million-dollar settlement, a number that would ensure her future, but also send a clear message that corruption would no longer be tolerated. Skylar had won. And the victory wasn't just for her. It was for every single person who had ever been wrongfully accused, wrongfully convicted, and wrongfully oppressed by a system built to protect the powerful and oppress the vulnerable. But that wasn't the end of the story. David Monroe wasn't content with just one victory. He wasn't done with the system that had tried to destroy his daughter. His quiet presence and steady influence began to shape the future in a way no one could have anticipated. Using his deep connections in the CIA, the FBI, and the DOJ, David was able to push for systemic police reform that would go beyond Skylar's case. The new law was groundbreaking. It required that officers who knowingly plant false evidence or frame innocent individuals would be held criminally liable. It was a law that demanded accountability from every officer in the force. No longer could corrupt cops hide behind blue walls. No longer could the system protect those who preyed on vulnerable people. It was a law that would change policing across the country. The new law passed through the legislature with overwhelming support, and the reforms David pushed for became a blueprint for police departments nationwide. Skylar Monroe's journey wasn't just hers. It had now ignited a revolution, one where the powerful could no longer get away with corruption and lies. The message was clear: if you break the law, you will pay the price. As Skylar stood with her father looking at the newspapers and headlines that read, "Corrupt cops brought to justice," she finally felt a sense of peace she hadn't thought was possible. But it wasn't just about the money or the settlement. It was about the moment when she knew she had won, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been wronged by the system. The final piece of her journey came when David and Skylar stood in front of the new police station, their steps echoing in the air. The old regime was gone, and in its place stood something different. The new police chief, one who was committed to justice and integrity, stood at the front, waiting to shake their hands. "Thank you for everything." The new chief said, his handshake firm and genuine. Skylar smiled, a real smile, a smile that reflected years of pain but also the freedom she had fought for. She looked at her father, and in that one look there was an entire lifetime of gratitude, but also a deep, unspoken respect. They had done it. They had taken down the corrupt system, piece by piece, and rebuilt something that was stronger, something that would protect the innocent. And as they turned and walked away, side by side, with the sunlight filtering through the trees, Skylar knew one thing for certain. She was free. If you enjoyed this story, click on the like and subscribe button, then share to others. See you in the next video.